Hello class, welcome to our lesson about multiplying and dividing decimals. I hope you're able to watch the YouTube video and get some perspective about why place value is important. Today's video I will actually be off the screen for a little bit because I didn't realize when I was writing some things that it would be covered up by when I would be in the corner of the screen. So I'll try to make sure I fix that for future lessons, but in the meantime you'll have to go through this one without me in the corner, and then hopefully I'll get that fixed later this week. Okay, everything we're looking at is multiplying and dividing decimals. So really, this is just kind of routine idea. So it should just be 2-digit or 3-digit multiplication. The one thing I want to bring to your attention is you don't need to line up the decimals. So if you look at these two examples, both are done in similar ways. But really, I'm just going to multiply 34 by 16 and then deal with the decimal point at the end. Don't forget to figure out where the decimal point ends up. You just move it over as many times as you need to. It also should match up with your estimated answer. For example, on the first one, if I were to estimate, it should be about 3 times 2, which is about 6. That dictates that that decimal has to be between the 5 and the 4. Mathematically, we've kind of all learned, like, oh, there's 2 spaces after the decimal, so move it back 2 spots. That's the same idea. On the second one, I would think most people would put the 17.4 at the top. But you don't need to line the decimal points up. These two happen to be lined up with what they are, but you don't have to do that. The other thing that you'll notice is in my examples, I put like a 0 with a slash to represent kind of the place value. So from the second question, I did 1 times 4, 1 times 7, and 1 times 1. And then I put a 0 with a slash. You don't have to put that slash here. I just do that to remind myself that's the place value for the 5, because it's actually 50, not 5. And then 5 times 4 is 20, carry the 2, and then etc., etc. Okay, you need to make sure you're able to do these pieces without a calculator. Obviously, with a calculator, there's no problem, but you need to be able to explain what's happening and where decimal points end up as you're looking at those questions. The next one is just an area formula. Area is length times width, so you just multiply the two together. You get 62.4 when you multiply them. Don't forget about units. The units here are inches squared. Some people just memorize, oh, it's area, so it's inches squared. The reason that this is inches squared is because really it's 12 inches times 5.2 inches. And if that's the case, 12 times 5.2 is the 62.4, and then inches times inches is inches squared, because something times itself is that thing squared. So that's why that piece would end up being 62.4 inches squared. The next two questions are just multiplication with variables involved. You just substitute. So the first one, 2.3 times b. I'm not going to go through the whole process of that question. If you have issues about finding the answer, let me know. And I know some of you are going to try to add a 0 in after that 2.3 to line up the decimal point. But for multiplication and division, we don't have to line up the decimal point like we do for addition and subtraction. So any example that I do like that, I'll probably just multiply through and then move the decimal at the end, 3 spots over for the 3 spots after the decimal. For the second one, it's 2 times a times b. You don't have to do 2 times both a and b, you just have to do 2 times one of them and then multiply by the other. That's kind of this idea of the associative properties of mathematics. You can kind of pick and choose which ones you multiply first. I would encourage you to try that last one and see if you can get that answer 42 and then the decimal 7424. See if you can find that. Challenge yourself to see if you can get that answer. For division, I'm just going with the most common ways that I typically see students divide. And it's always put the first number inside kind of the division piece, and then the second number goes on the outside. You always move the decimal point over depending on what's on the outside or the second number. And that's where the decimal point should end up. And then you just divide out regular like you would in any circumstance. Make sure when you're dealing with this scenario, though, make sure the decimal point lines up with what you're looking at. Okay, and then you do your long division to figure out the answer. This first one works out perfectly. The second one, what you'll notice is that the decimal point lines up, and then it's 7-2 repeating when you go through this process. The fact that there's an 11 that you're dividing by typically means that. Now this piece here, what would happen is you would have 7-2, 7-2, 7-2, etc. Make sure you read the directions of the question, because it'll either be a 7-2 repeating or maybe you have to round it, okay, depending on what the question is saying. So keep that in mind for your division questions. The next question has 35.7 slash. That still means division of 1.05. We could write it this way like the first one does. The second one, you could write it in the second way just with a fraction. And actually, that's where the division symbol comes from. It's a fraction bar. Okay, it's a number divided by a second number. So when you're dealing with this question, the first number divided by, or fraction, okay, the second number. This one you have to move the decimal over 2 spots because the bottom number in the division question, okay, is the one that dictates it. So you move it over 2 spots and you'll end up with an answer perfectly of 34. Just make sure you're practicing how to find those answers for division questions. I always love talking about real-world applications because that's really where mathematics becomes more important. This question deals with a dozen donuts. You may not know anything about donuts, but a dozen is 12 unless you have this baker's dozen, which is 13, which there's different reasons for that. You just divide the answer or the number by 12 and you get $1.76. And if you know anything about donuts, they better be really good donuts because that costs a little bit more than what you would think. So those are some things to keep in mind as you're looking at those questions. The last one is a number that doesn't work out very well. This is always what happens to students. I give them a question like this, they start going and they get 40 point blah, 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 and it keeps going and going and going and going. And they spend 30 minutes on a 40-minute test doing that one question. Here's the problem. The question says to round to the nearest hundredth. And if you have to round to the nearest hundredth, you only have to go 1, 2, 3 spots and then round to the nearest hundredth. So when you're looking at these questions, make sure you're rounding correctly as you're going through them, and make sure that you've rounded these questions that keep on going and going. If you don't see the directions about rounding, it means it's going to probably end fairly quickly. But if you see one that says rounding, like you could see on a Canvas quiz, for example, it probably means, okay, once you find the answer, then round to the correct location as you're dealing with that question. Again, if you're struggling with the setup of some of these things, make sure you practice them. The homework's going to be important for you to practice those pieces as well. Okay, and that's everything that we have for today. Decimals, multiply, divide worksheet. The answer's on the back page. Make sure you look at that. And then just a note, there's an assessment coming up on Thursday that will be graded, and that will cover basically this first week of lessons. So make sure that you're ready for that, and that's coming up on Thursday. Have a good day, everybody.